On Saturday, June 8th, 2024, the headline in the Wall Street Journal Saturday Review section read, "The Hidden Life of Google's Secret Weapon." The author was Brody Mullins, a veteran investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal. This series ran over 3 days. The focus was on a man named Joshua Wright, a lawyer and former law professor with George Mason University Law School. Under the Journal headline, the paper declares that Wright cleared a path to domination for the world's tech companies, keeping regulators at bay while juggling inappropriate relationships and skirting conflict of interest rules at every turn. Brody Mullins, with his brother Luke Mullins, also has a new book out called The Wolves of K Street.
Hi, I'm Susan Swain. This summer, I'll be on the air from Milwaukee and Chicago for C-SPAN's live gavel-to-gavel convention coverage. It's been a mainstay of our network since 1984. What has changed in recent years is C-SPAN's funding, now challenged by the many homes who have opted to cut the cord. This summer, an anonymous donor is generously helping support C-SPAN with a matching gift campaign. Every dollar given will be matched up to $25,000. Please consider giving to support our no commentary convention coverage and all of C-SPAN's public affairs programming. To learn more or to make a donation, find us at cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
Brody Mullins, who was Joshua Wright?
Yeah, Joshua Wright is a well-known antitrust lawyer in Washington, D.C. He's really a professor at George Mason University, which is a conservative law school outside of Washington. But over his time in Washington, he became sort of one of the leading advocates for a sort of hands-off view of antitrust enforcement and law. So he basically led the charge for big U.S. companies who didn't want the Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Department of the DOJ to enforce antitrust law. So he sort of became the champion of sort of this hands-off view of regulation in D.C.
Okay, I'm going to go right to the essence of your piece in the Journal. Who is Angela Landry? Who is Elise Dorsey? Who is Lindsay Edwards? Who is Brandy Wagstaff? Who is Krista Laser?
Okay. Almost all of those are former law students of Joshua Wright. So Joshua Wright was a professor at George Mason. He taught the first year contracts law that every first year law student needs to take at George Mason. And while he was a professor there, he essentially started preying on some of the women in his class, starting with Brandy Wagstaff back in 2005, I believe. He would sort of send emails or track down various women in his class, try to strike up relationships with them. And in many cases, he did start relationships with students in his class, which relationships that carried on in some cases for many years or more than a decade.
Were they consensual relationships?
They were consensual relationships, yes. But these women say that, some of the women say that they were sexually harassed by him because over time, they realized that they were sort of felt trapped in these relationships, that the antitrust world is very small, very insular. Joshua Wright was at the top of it. They were trying to break into it, and they felt like he was a gatekeeper, and they needed to continue these relationships with him.
It's not terribly normal for the Wall Street Journal to have a 3-day series. How did you develop this series?
So I had been at the Wall Street Journal for almost 20 years. I've never written a 3-part series before, so that makes it very unusual. I started reporting on Joshua Wright last fall. He's a prominent antitrust lawyer who everyone's sort of known about for a while. I mean, I knew his name, and I knew that he was important. I knew he worked for big tech companies and other companies. I didn't know about this secret life of his. And once I found out about his secret life, I started trying to pull together a story last fall. We had lots of changes at the Wall Street Journal that ended up dragging the story out for a while. But yeah, I've never done a 3-part series, and I don't know if they're going to do one again.
How did you find this story in the first place?
So again, I'd known about Josh Wright for a while. In fact, in our book, we mentioned him as someone who secretly worked for Google, but we did not. I did not know about this secret private life he had until last summer. Last summer being early August 2023, Josh Wright suddenly resigned from George Mason University. And when he resigned, he posted something on Twitter or Facebook or online. And when he resigned, a bunch of other professors at George Mason went online and sort of praised his work and said that George Mason would never be the same. That upset one of the women who had had an encounter with him. And so she started posting to his reply saying, that Josh Wright had sexually harassed her. And in fact, she then posted some of the emails that Josh Wright had sent to her, and that sort of sparked then other people chiming in and saying, I was also sexually harassed by Joshua Wright, and all of a sudden it sort of snowballed. So it was public last summer that several women had accused him of wrongdoing. So what I sort of did in that story is piece together his private life working for Google and Facebook and Amazon, these big tech companies, with his sort of secret personal life, and I kind of pieced them together into one long story, or three long stories.
What role does George Mason University play in this story?
That's a good question. It's really hard to tell. The allegations from these women and others is that Josh Wright's behavior was an open secret, that people knew what he was doing, people knew he was preying on students. In fact, Brandy Wagstaff, who we quote in the story, had a sexual relationship with him in 2005 or 6, I believe. What she said was that it would be stunning to her if the people who were in the offices next to Josh Wright didn't see his behavior, didn't see this parade of women coming into his office, didn't see the lights being turned off, didn't see him, coming into his office with, 21 or 22-year-old, young female students. So she thought like the administration probably knew. An interesting part here about Josh Wright's life is that he was a tremendous fundraiser. He brought in millions and millions and millions of dollars, mainly from big tech companies, but also from other large U.S. companies, to George Mason University, to the law school, and to an institute that he ran there. So an allegation is that these universities and university presidents and administrators are judged these days in part by how much money they bring in, and Josh Wright was a cash cow. So there was not an incentive. There was a big disincentive to trying to figure out what he was doing and clean up his behavior, because it would cost the university millions of dollars, which it has.
I listed all the women that you talk about in your piece, but in fairness to Krista Laser, she did not have a relationship with him. But tell that story.
Yeah, so Krista Laser was applying for a job. She was a antitrust lawyer, well-respected antitrust lawyer at Cleveland State University. She had previously lived in Washington, D.C. She was divorced and had young kids who live in Washington, D.C., and she was stuck in Cleveland. So she wanted to come and get a job in D.C. to be close to her family. She saw there was a job opening at George Mason's law school in the field that she was in, and she called up the person who was in charge of hiring, and that person was Joshua Wright. And Joshua Wright said, hey, my schedule's super busy. Why don't we meet for dinner in a couple of days? Apparently, those sorts of meetings over dinner are not unusual. So they met for dinner. They had a conversation. Some of it was personal. She said that she was divorced. She said she was trying to get to D.C. He shared that some information about his personal life. And anyway, they had a discussion in which Josh Wright, according to Krista, says, we probably have a job for you. There's something here I can get for you. The dean always listens to my recommendations, so this is heading in a good direction. I'll see what I can do. They left dinner. She says that she was walked to her car by him, which she thought was unusual. Then she said that she gave him an unusually long hug, which she sort of raised some eyebrows. But more importantly, that night, she gets an email from Josh Wright on his personal email, not his George Mason email, essentially asking her out on a date. And she immediately thought this was awkward, that she's in a position where she's asking him for a job. He's asking her to go on a date. She found this inappropriate. She later referred that conversation to the school, and nothing really came of it.
What does the Federal Trade Commission have to do with this story?
So the Federal Trade Commission is one of the leading pro-consumer regulatory bodies in Washington. They're the U.S. government's leading agency for reining in the abuses or excesses of corporate power in Washington. The Federal Trade Commission was created in 1918, and its job is to review corporate mergers, to find out if there are allegations of consumer abuse by big companies, and then to rein them in. Josh Wright, because he's an antitrust lawyer, was an expert in antitrust policy and what the FTC does. at one point in 2012, he was appointed by President Obama and confirmed by the Senate as an FTC commissioner.
But as a Republican?
As a Republican. So there's 5 FTC commissioners. If there's a Republican president, there are 3 Republican commissioners. At the time Obama was president, there was 3 Democratic commissioners and 2 Republicans. He was one of the Republicans. Now, what's interesting at the FTC and in antitrust law these days, there's a big new debate. It's not about Republicans against Democrats the way it is in almost everything else in Washington. In the antitrust law, there's 2 teams. There are people who want a strenuous enforcement of antitrust law to rein in big companies. But most people at the FTC, most antitrust regulators, and most companies want a lax antitrust enforcement. They want the government to stay out of the industry, stay out of the marketplace, not weigh in on mergers, certainly not block mergers. That view has been the predominant one for 50 years at the FTC, and at the DOJ. So for 50 years, the FTC and DOJ have really had a hands-off role in the marketplace. They have not filed many antitrust lawsuits. They have not accused companies of being monopolies. That's beginning to change now. Josh Wright, when he was at George Mason, was really one of the leading advocates for that hands-off view. And then when he went to the FTC, he sort of had his hands on the tools of influence, where he could really prevent the FTC from interjecting itself and blocking mergers.
Did he talk to you?
No, I spoke with his lawyers.
What did they tell you?
They told me that there are many facts in the story that were not true. They wouldn't tell us what those facts were. After the stories came out, they didn't accuse us. They didn't point out any factual errors. More importantly, on a broader level, they said, all these women were in consensual relationships with Josh Wright, that he did nothing wrong. In fact, George Mason, at the time that Josh Wright was a professor there, didn't have a clear rule saying that professors couldn't date students. So they said he didn't violate any rules here. Meantime, I should say that 2 of these women have accused Josh Wright of sexually harassing them. In response to that, Josh Wright has filed a $108 million defamation case against these 2 women, which is moving forward in court. So according to Josh Wright and his lawyers, he has been the one who's been wronged here, because his reputation has been defamed by these accusations of sexual harassment.
How many of the women talked to you?
Most of the women who I contacted were willing to talk, whether it's on the record or on background. I mean, these women have filed, 2 of the women have filed public complaints against him. They have responded in court to his allegations that they defamed him. So almost everyone is out there publicly. But of course, sexual harassment is usually a private matter. There's lots of other women who I spoke to who believe that they might have been harassed by Josh Wright, who don't want to become public, who don't want their names public. But every woman whose name is in the story, agreed to let their name become public.
What kind of reaction did you have when the series ran in June?
So more than 1 million people read the stories, and for the Wall Street Journal, that's a grand slam. The stories were a big hit. I think lots of people thought, one, his behavior was reprehensible, but also, this guy was sort of secretly lobbying and impacting federal policy on monopolies, on antitrust. I mean, he was a big reason why the federal government has never been able to rein in the tech companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon. So there's a whole other side of this story where we were sort of exposing one of the reasons that Google, Amazon, Facebook have avoided any major antitrust scrutiny until now.
How old is Joshua Wright today?
That's a good question. He is about 37.
Your article says 47.
47, sorry, off by a decade. 47.
Where's he from originally?
He's from San Diego. He has a really interesting backstory. He seemed to grow up in a very modest house, very modest background, but he had an uncle who went to UCLA Law School, who worked at the Federal Trade Commission, who enforced antitrust law at the Federal Trade Commission. His job at the Federal Trade Commission was to review and block major mergers, and he did block a few mergers in his time. He then left and went to the private sector, went through what we call a revolving door, went to work for a big law firm that defends big U.S. companies in mergers. Then he swung back to the FTC for a short tenure, and then back to corporate America. So he made millions and millions of dollars as a lawyer in private practice, defending companies, using some of the skills that he learned, while he was at the FTC. The point here is that Josh Wright comes up with a fairly modest background, sees his uncle and the riches his uncle has made, and some of Josh Wright's girlfriends told me that Josh Wright saw that his path to riches was through his uncle's path, and therefore he went to UCLA Law School just like his uncle did, went to the FTC just like his uncle did, and went into private practice. So he sort of followed the path of his uncle, and it worked.
What's he doing today?
The uncle or Josh Wright?
Josh Wright.
He is doing nothing but working on these lawsuits. As soon as it became public last summer that all these women had accused him of sexual harassment, all of his big clients fired him. Google fired him. Facebook stopped doing work with him. Walmart stopped doing work with him. He had a contract with the American Enterprise Institute. They got rid of him. And then several major law firms where he was working fired him. So what's interesting here is that at George Mason University, where which was his public job, where he said, anytime he testified or anytime he wrote a paper, he said, "I'm Josh Wright. I'm a professor at George Mason University." He made $400,000 there, which is pretty good for a professor, I think. He made $2 million secretly, undisclosed, working for tech companies. So so really, if you look at his financial earnings, he was much more of an advocate for tech companies than he was a professor. But he sort of cast himself as a professor because it gave him credibility in advocating for those tech companies, which were really his clients.
What's the message for people that have no knowledge, particularly of Washington, that you find in this story?
The message for me is that almost everyone who works and lives in Washington, D.C. is involved in the influence business in one way or another. If you look at the federal lobbying database, this is where anyone who lobbies Washington is supposed to register as a lobbyist. There's a legal definition involved in what it means to become a lobbyist. Under that lobbying database, under those lobbying rules, 11 or 12,000 people in Washington, D.C. are lobbyists. And in fact, I think it's more like hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, there's 4 or 5 million people who live in the Washington, D.C. area. If you don't work for if you're not a elementary school teacher or a bus driver or work in a restaurant or work in the media, you're probably involved in advocacy for a company or for an interest group in one way or another. That's what Josh Wright was doing. And what's interesting to me, which is actually more a topic for our book, is that lobbying has sort of moved in D.C. from those registered, disclosed lobbyists who go up to Capitol Hill and ask for favors to more like people like Josh Wright, people who are experts on topics, who are influencers on policy, who are listened to by policymakers and by members of Congress. So many of those people are actually working as lobbyists on behalf of companies or other interest groups.
So for the average person, might pick up the Wall Street Journal someday and see an op-ed piece, see an opinion piece, and it's written by a guy like Joshua Wright. What do you not know? And what's the responsibility of the journal to tell us when we read that?
So you need to be wary. I mean, in my career as a reporter, I've written several stories about people who published op-eds in USA Today or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post who were actually paid to write those op-eds. In fact, when Google was trying to, when Google did escape an FTC antitrust investigation in 2012, one of the things they did was hire Josh Wright and several dozen other antitrust experts to write op-eds around the country where people at the FTC read them, important senators read them, people in the media read them, regular Americans read them and said, oh, well, this professor, if he says that the FTC doesn't have a good case against Google, well, then maybe the FTC doesn't have a good case against Google. It turns out that Google paid for all those op-eds. They funded all the people who are writing the op-ed. So, so I think you always need to be wary. Now, I know that some publications, maybe most of them, have rules that say if you write an op-ed, you need to disclose whether you are an advocate for some industry or another. And I think the standard is at the end of an op-ed, it'll say, Brody Mullins is a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, but he's also, a paid advocate for Google or whatever the case may be. So you're supposed to disclose those ties. But I know that doesn't happen all the time. And in fact, in the case of Josh Wright, it rarely happened. He would say, this op-ed's been written by Josh Wright, a professor at George Mason University.
Or, as you point out in your piece, this has been written by Josh Wright, who is the director of the Global Antitrust Institute at George Mason University.
Right.
And what's that?
And what is the...
And how much disclosure is there when you come in and money comes into there from Google and Facebook and Walmart and all these places?
Yeah. What's fascinating is that at law schools, which is what we're talking about here, there are almost no rules. There are rules at medical schools. I mean, we remember decades ago there were scandals about tobacco companies and some of the ag companies funding academic research that supported their positions. That resulted in medical schools requiring disclosure of corporate donations to fund papers or corporate donations to universities or to groups within universities. This new era of tech and tech policy is relatively new. Tech companies weren't around more than 20 years ago. The schools that write papers or have academic research involving tech companies are law schools, not med schools. So law schools are relatively new to this game, and it's about should antitrust laws apply, or should intellectual property apply, or what should privacy rules be for children or for minors or whatnot. So all those debates are legal debates taking place at law schools, and law schools have been slow to the game in coming up with rules like this. You asked about the Global Antitrust Institute. So the Global Antitrust Institute was an organization started at George Mason University by Josh Wright. And the idea here is that Josh Wright wanted to train federal judges and foreign judges, foreign regulators, on a sort of lax interpretation of antitrust law that he agrees in. And the idea is that in the United States, if the Federal Trade Commission or the Antitrust Department of the Justice Department believes a company is violating the law, they need to sue them in court. So Josh Wright and big tech companies essentially lobby those agencies not to bring cases. But then, very smartly in their case, they then go to the jury. Basically, they go to judges and train them on their view of antitrust. And the idea is that if the Federal Trade Commission or the Justice Department files a lawsuit, they go to judges who are all of a sudden trained in this business-friendly view of antitrust. Josh Wright and the Global Antitrust Institute is responsible for that. They have trained hundreds of judges. The training sessions are always in some vacation destination. They're fully paid for by companies who donate to the Global Antitrust Institute. They're almost like vacations that judges take. They're free. You can bring your spouse. So judges go to these. They learn sort of one side of the interpretation of antitrust law, the pro-business side. And the hope is, and it's been successful, that when they hear cases, the FTC suing Facebook or FTC suing Google, that they take the business side because they've been trained by Josh Wright.
How many antitrust cases are now active among companies like Google?
So things seem to be changing here in Washington. I mentioned before that for the last 50 years, the government, the FTC and DOJ have taken on this lax view of antitrust enforcement and allowed companies to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. That's starting to change now. In the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, more and more Americans, more and more Republicans and Democrats have said, hey, these companies have gotten too big and they need to be reined in. So therefore in the Trump administration, with a lawsuit by DOJ against Google, accusing it of being a monopoly, that case sort of went away. But when Biden became president, he nominated 2 very vigorous FTC and DOJ antitrust enforcers, Lena Khan at the FTC and Jonathan Cantor at DOJ. They have been the most aggressive regulators we've seen in 100 years at those agencies. They have filed a number of cases. There's a case, there's actually 2 cases against Google, one of them reviving the Trump case, 1 case against Apple and a case against Amazon. So 4 big cases right now that are sort of moving their way through the system. Because the courts have been for so many years so pro-business, we'll see what happens with those cases. But at least on the enforcement side, the agency side, things are much more aggressive in the last couple of years than they have been.
Would you have had a story if there hadn't been the sex relations part of this?
I don't think so, because I have known about Josh Wright for a long time. He certainly, he shows up at our book. He was an important person, but 2 things happened to make this a story. One is that antitrust, an issue that should, for most people, is relatively boring and has kind of been a boring topic for 100 years. All of a sudden, the country's views on antitrust are changing, and to me, that's fascinating. The country, Republicans and Democrats, for 50 years have said bigger is better. Let these companies grow. Let them merge. And that they will help consumers. They'll give us more choices, and they can then better compete overseas. And now all of a sudden, Republicans and Democrats are saying, no, these companies are too big. They have too much influence over our lives, and they need to be reined in. So that change is fascinating. And then with Josh Wright, this sort of secret personal life he had, to me, those two factors made for a great story.
While you were writing the story and gathering information, did anybody, the big word, did anybody threaten you on this story?
No, I mean, I think Josh Wright's lawyers obviously didn't want me to run a story, and they talked about legal action. I mean, they're still free to take legal action against me and or the Journal. The Wall Street Journal and myself are very, very careful when we write stories like this, because we know we're going after someone's livelihood and exposing things that they don't want to know. So one, we're very careful about the facts, but we're also very careful to be fair. In this case, so much of the information that ended up being published in our stories had already been public in these lawsuits that Josh Wright has filed and the countersuits by the women. So in a defense from a lawsuit, or a good defense from a lawsuit, is that we're getting this information from public sources, these lawsuits, which we did.
What episode had the biggest impact on Josh Wright's family?
What do you mean by episode? What?
Well, I mean the divorce that came out of it, and what triggered the divorce.
Yeah.
And in your story, you tell us how much the house was worth and how much money his wife and family got, and his three kids.
So, obviously his wife and kids have been dragged through the mud. They did nothing wrong. Certainly that his children did nothing wrong. I think that, things really started going haywire for Josh Wright 5 or 6 years ago, 2018 and 19. He was working for a law firm called Wilson Sonsini. At the time, I believe his wife had suspected that he was having an affair or affairs. In fact, he was having 4 or 5 affairs over the course of a couple of years, in addition to having a wife and 3 children. So there was a point, though, when his wife, I guess looking through or rummaging through his documents at home, came across a travel receipt for work that listed the name of one of the women who he was having an affair with. That woman's name is Lindsay Edwards. The wife was suspicious at that point, ultimately called Lindsay Edwards at her office and said, "Are you having an affair with my husband?" I'm pretty sure that that Lindsay Edwards denied the affair, but the women kept talking over time, which was unusual. There was sort of an unusual alliance here because they were both mad at Josh Wright, even though they were both sleeping with him. So his wife obviously is suspecting something's going on. Lindsay Edwards was a young associate at Wilson Sonsini. She had met Josh Wright at George Mason University, where she was a student also. There was a 10-plus year age gap, and she worked for him at the firm. Josh Wright kept promising her that they were going to get married, they were going to move in together, they were going to have children and start a life. And after a while, she thought, wait a second, this is not happening, you're still with your wife. So she started getting upset about his refusal to leave his wife. This is now the fall of 2019. At some point, other young associates at the firm, Lindsay Edwards' colleagues, became suspicious also. Lindsay Edwards was all of a sudden getting these great assignments. She was going to meetings with Josh Wright at the FTC. She was talking to Google, and they weren't getting these assignments, and they thought, what's going on? Then they saw them together a lot. They saw them leaving the office, and they grew suspicious and thought, oh, Lindsay Edwards is getting these great assignments because she's sleeping with the boss, which is something that you're not supposed to do. They then started clamoring for an investigation inside the firm. Eventually, there was an investigation, and remarkably, the firm brought in Josh Wright and said, hey, are you having an affair with Lindsay Edwards, your associate? And he said no. And then they brought in Lindsay Edwards, who at this point is upset that Josh Wright is still with his wife. And they say, Lindsay Edwards, are you having an affair with Josh Wright, your boss? And she says yes. And at that point, Josh Wright was pushed out of the firm.
So what happened to the relationship between Lindsay Edwards and Josh Wright?
It's hard to explain here. So around that point, they broke up for 2 or 3 months, from November, December to maybe November, December 2019 to early in 2020, they broke up. During that time, she became friendly with some of the, or she continued, she spoke often, sort of created an alliance with some of the other women who were having affairs with Josh Wright. Josh Wright's wife leaves him at that point, kicks him out of the house. I think she kicked him out of the house in January 2020. So all of a sudden he's suddenly on his own. Josh Wright is. His wife starts divorce proceedings. Josh Wright reaches out to Lindsay Edwards, the woman he was sleeping with at Wilson Zini, and tries to rekindle their relationship. He's eventually successful, and he and Lindsay Edwards then stay together. The wife divorces him. The other women sort of scatter, and so he ended up staying with and moving in with Lindsay Edwards.
So if you look at this stand back from and look at it from what would we would call in this era, this is hard, good government. Best practices, all the words that they use about honesty and all that. What are the triggers here? In other words, as a reporter, what are the things that matter to you? Example, you've got lots of quotes in here and lots of information, and you say in each article, emails, lawsuits, all that stuff. Where did you find the most valuable information?
Ironically, the most valuable information came from Josh Wright. I mean, if you were to take his lawsuits, the information that he included in his lawsuits, which includes, by the way, in order to support some of his positions against these women and to defend against the women's countersuits, he includes emails and text messages and screenshots of all the conversations he was having with these women. And a lot of those quotes are in our story. So he put a lot out there himself. I mean, had he not filed this lawsuit, we probably would have had a story, but it might have been a one-part story, not a three-part story. I mean, he put a lot out there himself. And then in the women in their countersuits, they included their own emails and text messages. So we really had a lot to work with from just the public record.
You had a picture or a couple of pictures in the article of one of the women, and I believe it was Landry.
Angela Landry.
Angela Landry. Why did you all take the journal,
Yes.
take the picture? And
Yeah,
why did she allow that? What was her interest in that?
I might be speculating here a bit, but the journal has a photography staff, obviously, and the photography staff asked me how to get a hold of the women, and I asked the women, hey, would you be willing to be shot for photos? They all agreed. I think their idea is that they believe that to end sexual harassment, more broadly, that women need to speak out. They made a decision last August, to stand up and say that Josh Wright had sexually harassed them, and I think they're carrying through with their pledge to stand up to Josh Wright, and hopefully that will encourage other women in similar situations to stand up for themselves. I mean, I don't think these women have that much to gain. They are very prominent, very highly educated, very smart women working at major law firms in D.C. and respected people in the antitrust bar. So to stand up here and still building their careers, and to stand up and create this huge distraction on something so personal, I think takes a lot of courage.
This was published around the first week in June on a Saturday, Monday, and Tuesday. When did you finish it?
So I finished. So I had worked all last fall, the fall of 2023, reporting the story. I didn't know exactly where the story was going to go. There had been some turmoil at the Wall Street Journal where my direct editor had left the Journal. The page one editor at the Journal had been fired. The bureau chief, who would be someone I report to, were also fired. So for 3 months or so, I had literally no bosses. And I had thought I had this great story, so I kept reporting. And eventually, I think in November, I said, hey, let's start writing and see what we have here. A normal front page story in the Wall Street Journal is 2,000 words. I wrote a 13,000 word draft, so I knew I had too much. But I also had no one really to talk to about this story, since I didn't have any editors at the time. Around Christmas, I sent the story to the new page one editor in New York. I know that Christmas at the end of the year is a very busy time for front page editors because there's all sorts of stories they're trying to get in by the end of the year. So I didn't hear back for a couple of weeks, and that was a very normal process. Strange hiccup is I then got laid off from the Wall Street Journal in February. So I had left the Journal. One of the things that bothered me about leaving the Journal was really this story. I felt like this was a fantastic story. and I had sort of sent it to the Journal, and then I was leaving the Journal. So luckily, a few weeks, maybe a few days after I left the Journal, I got a call from the page one editor who had read the story and said, "Hey, this is fantastic. How can we get this done?" And I said, I'd love to finish this story. So they kept me on payroll for another few months in order to finish the story. So if the stories came out June 1st or June 2nd or whenever that was about my last days. So this is sort of my mic drop at the Wall Street Journal.
Why were you laid off?
I don't know. It's sort of a complicated story. I don't have a full picture. The Wall Street Journal did a bunch of restructuring in D.C. I worked on a 7-person team that covered business in Washington. They closed down that division. There's a bunch of reporters who covered financial services and regulatory agencies. They were laid off. So I think about 30 people in D.C., including editors, reporters and editors were laid off. I don't have a good explanation for why that was. There have been, since then, other layoffs at the Journal. So I don't have a good answer. I know some of my colleagues have asked, why was I laid off, and they were not given satisfactory answers. But the good news for me is that I have a very long severance, so I'm going to sort of take that severance and figure out what to do next, maybe write another book. Or
You have a family?
Yep. I have my wife, Lauren, has been very supportive, and 3 great kids. Nola, who's about to turn 12, Navy, who's 9, and my young boy, Bobby, who's 4.
You have any idea what you'll end up doing?
I don't. I've written this book that came. So the other reason that was the timing of me getting laid off was not terrible is that I had this story to finish up, and I had a book called The Wolves of K Street that came out on May 6th. So I was sort of gearing up my, doing a book tour and doing book talks around the time I was laid off. So suddenly having all this time off and not having a full-time job, actually worked out really well because I sort of moved into publicity. The book is mainly about the rise of corporate power in D.C. But the end of it is a little bit about the fraying of the pro-business alliance, maybe the beginning of the decline of corporate influence in D.C. I think that could be a great topic for another book right now. So I may, one of my ideas is to sort of pursue that, but I need to think that through, come up with a proposal, and get a book deal first.
I'm holding the book in my hand, and I want to ask you why the title is The Wolves of K Street.
That's a good question. I don't know. We had thought we had probably 24 different names that we're trying to think of, trying to come up with, or proposing for a title. Somehow I came up with The Wolves of K Street one night, and it sort of stuck. K Street is the avenue in D.C. where the lobbying industry is based, sort of like Madison Avenue in New York or Wall Street in New York. K Street is where the lobbying industry used to be based. Many lobbying firms are no longer based on that street, but K Street is sort of the term of art for the lobbying world. And Wolves of K Street, we sort of see them as like, these are like the bad guys on Wall Street, or or on K Street. These are the people who are really the most exceptional characters that we chose to write about.
Jim Kortovich. He had some strong things to say to you in the book. Who is he, and why did he have these strong things to say to you?
So we write about 4 or 5 lobbyists / influence peddlers. We write about their lives and careers in D.C. All of them had incredibly rapid ascents and steep declines. A couple of them ended up dead. A couple of them ended up with their firms in shambles. And those 5 lobbyists help us explain how Washington has changed in the last 50 years, how companies have gone from having very little influence in Washington to being incredibly influential in Washington, and also how lobbying has changed. Jim Kortovich is one of the characters we write about. We write about him because he is someone he came from New Hampshire. He had a very novel idea about how to influence policy in Washington, which was to not be a lobbyist, but to sort of try to influence the media. So he would throw big lavish parties in DC, invite reporters from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post and C-SPAN, or CNN, no one from C-SPAN, from CNN and other folks. And he sort of created this big roster of friends in the media who he would then turn to for favors on behalf of clients. One good example we have in the book is after the financial crisis, Goldman Sachs and its CEO was under the gun. There were hearings in the Senate with the then chairman or president of Goldman Sachs, and Goldman Sachs knew the media publications and knew the reporters on Wall Street, but didn't know the folks in D.C. So they hired Jim Kortovich because Jim Kortovich said, "Hey, I know all these men and women." So Goldman Sachs paid him at first $50,000 a month to basically try to influence or get their stories out, get their defense out to this small group of Capitol Hill reporters who were covering those hearings. And then he took that model and replicated it for many other clients.
Well, I can't use the language, but I'm going to read what you have quoted him as saying to you. How did you get this from him?
Texts and emails.
You're an effing moron who lives in S-ville. That's the word. I'm coming after you full guns, and that's why I live where I do, and why you live where you do, and that's why I've never worked in a cubicle or taken the metro. We are going to the mattress, and like everything in my life, I will win.
Yeah. So the situation here is that, in Washington, there's people who have power and influence, and there's people who make it seem like they have power and influence. In our case, we're writing about this guy, Jim Kortovich, who had created this image of being incredibly influential in Washington, incredibly powerful. And our book says that, in fact, that he's not, that he has lied about his clients, he's involved in a kickback scheme at some point. A lot of the money that he made in his life was through an illegal kickback scheme with one of his clients where he's not actually doing much work but getting paid millions of dollars. So we were sort of exposing that in this book, which therefore is not going to be good for his reputation and his career and his the prospects of future clients. So I think he was threatening, using any threat, any method he could to try to get us to not write about him. And one way that people who are being written about in books or stories try to get out of it is by threatening to sue. And that's essentially what he was doing, saying, I'm going to sue you, I'm going to take your house, I'm going to take your money. And that was his tactic.
I saw a picture in preparation for this of Mr. Kortovich and he was dating at the time Jeff Zeleny of CNN, a reporter. I think it was at the White House.
Yes.
Walking in, holding hands, but it's stated, I don't know whether you stated it or not, but they're no longer dating.
Correct.
What's that image of a CNN reporter with a big-time lobbyist together? Do you know any more about that?
So I think that Jim Kortovich, in order to create this perception that he was very close with people in the media, wanted to have around him people in the media and wanted people to sort of see him as sort of a friendly person and not sort of a lobbyist or not a paid consultant for corporations, but more like a friend of the media. And through that process, he dated Jeff Zeleny for many years. They broke up a couple years ago, but I think that image was good for Jim because there's so many reporters who knew Jeff Zeleny and were friends with Jeff Zeleny and worked with him at the Chicago Tribune or at the New York Times or at ABC or at CNN, and having Jeff around made Jim seem more friendly. It seemed like he was more part of the reporting team, and reporters sort of let their guards down.
How much of that kind of relationship between lobbyist and journalist goes on in this town?
I think a lot. To be fair, I've been a reporter who's covered lobbying and business in Washington for 20 or 25 years, and lobbyists are some of my best sources because I can go up to Capitol Hill and cover a subcommittee hearing, and you can try to call all 17 members on that subcommittee, Republicans and Democrats, or call all 17 press secretaries, and it's hard for me to get information that way. Lobbyists have already done that. They're going to the fundraisers, they're playing golf with the members, they have relationships with staffers. So I always found lobbyists to be a great resource for me. Now you have to know that if you're talking to a lobbyist for a company, they have one view. But as long as I know that and can sort of try to filter that out, or if I talk to multiple lobbyists to sort of triangulate or to get different viewpoints, I think that's a good way of reporting. So I think, in fact, I would say that more reporters should have those relationships with lobbyists in order to get information. In this case, the lobbyist was trying to spin reporters and give them, plant stories with them that they would write. They would help clients or hurt clients or advance their causes in Washington. I think that's a little bit different.
What story in your book, I don't know that you consider it your best, but what one is the best explanation of the way the town works?
Yeah, so the best story, and the one that we start with, is a lobbyist named Evan Morris, who we actually spoke about here on the show 6 or 7 years ago. So I originally wrote the story for the Wall Street Journal in 2017 and then became the center of this book. So there's a lobbyist named Evan Morris who is a young, hotshot, up-and-coming lobbyist for a big pharmaceutical company. He was making a ton of money. He was incredibly successful for his firm. And he was using sort of new age lobbying tactics, as in, lobbying in Washington used to be a game played with campaign donations and rounds of golf and expensive meals together, so that lawmakers and lobbyists became friends, and then good inside and connected lobbyists which could get favors from their members of Congress. That doesn't happen as much anymore. Lobbying takes place more, I think, out in the country, where lobbyists know that in order to get a member of Congress to come around to their position, they need to get 51%. If a majority of constituents support a trade bill or a tax cut, then the lawmaker will follow and will vote that way. So a lot of lobbying now has moved outside of D.C. and trying to build campaigns in states or in key districts to get the public to support a corporate issue, and then the member will follow. That's kind of where Evan Morris played. And what's interesting there is that Evan Morris and his company had an influence budget, a Washington budget, of $50 million. $5 million of that $50 million was spent in traditional lobbying, what we think of as the fat cat lobbyists going up to Capitol Hill and trying to get favors. $45 million of that was spent outside of D.C. So that just sort of shows how much more prevalent that type of lobbying is. Interesting note here is that under the lobbying disclosure laws, the $5 million that's spent in D.C. on traditional lobbyists, that money needs to be disclosed by lobbyists who are required to register their activities, what they're doing, how much they're getting paid, who their clients are. The other $45 million has no disclosure to the government, to the public, to reporters, and in this case, even to his company. So Evan Morris realized that he could start stealing that money, and he teamed up with Jim Kortovich, the guy we just talked about, and they sort of created some fake campaigns, some very broad contracts, and Evan Morris would send $2 million to Jim Kortovich, and he'd send half of it back, and they did that for 10 years without anyone noticing. And so I think that was the most amazing story.
But you say in the back of your book, where you talk about some of the people you've been writing about, after Evan Morris's death, Morris's wife Tracy and Evan Morris's estate reached a settlement agreement with Genentech for money the company believed was stolen. When did he die? What did he die of? And did he ever? Was he ever charged?
So it's the tragic story that it's the opening scene in our book. So Evan Morris and Jim Kortovich have this scam where they're passing millions of dollars back and forth. Evan Morris is sending tens of millions of dollars in Genentech money to Jim Kortovich and his companies. Jim Kortovich is sending half that money or a portion of that money back in a classic kickback scheme. That goes on for 10 years. In July 2015, or I should say, in the spring of 2015, Genentech, which is based outside of San Francisco, gets a letter from an anonymous tipster, a whistleblower, saying, hey, you should look into Evan Morris, the way he's spending, there's something fishy that's going on. So the company hires or turns to an outside lawyer to do an investigation. They start looking into Evan Morris and all of his expenditures, and they see all this money going to companies run by Jim Kortovich, and they just are curious about what is this guy doing? What's he hired for? What work is he producing? And is it worth all this money? In July 2015, Genentech's top lawyer reaches out to Evan Morris, who's playing golf at the time, and says, hey, I'm going to be in D.C. tomorrow. Clear your schedule. Evan Morris, who has been stealing money from his company for 10 years, is obviously worried that the top lawyer of the firm is coming into Washington. So the next morning, he drives into the office. He goes to meet with the outside law firm, and within a short period of time, he realizes, the game is up. Like, they're on to me. So he excused himself from the meeting. He gets in his Porsche and he leaves D.C. He drives out to his favorite golf course, which is Robert Trent Jones golf course outside of D.C. Meantime, his wife is incredibly concerned about him. His wife knows of this big meeting, knows he was worried about it. His wife is texting him and saying, hey, what happened in the meeting? And Evan Morris is giving her sort of curt replies, not really giving her a full answer. At some point, he goes dark. She hasn't heard from him. He hasn't come home from work. She's getting very worried. She doesn't know that he's gone to the golf course. she starts calling his friends. Have you seen him? Where's his car? You know, she's really getting worried. And one of her friends suggests looking at his credit card statements. So she goes online, looks at his credit card statements, and saw that he made a purchase at a store called Loudon Guns. He's not a gun owner. He's not a hunter. So she knew this was bad news. She really gets anxious at that point. Meantime, Evan Morris has played a round of golf. He's cleaned up. He went to the bar at Robert Trent Jones Golf Course. He bought a $2,000 bottle of wine. He gets some cigars, and he goes down to a fire pit off the 18th hole. And there he starts sending his wife a few more text messages, including information about their tax accountant, their personal lawyer, and their life insurance policy. You know, she gets even more worried at that point. He sends her a final text message that says, I'm ready to be done with this, basically. And not long after that, he killed himself.
Tony Podesta, Heather Podesta, and John Podesta.
Right. There's a whole nother book to be done here just on the Podesta family and how they've changed Washington. We really write mostly about Tony Podesta. Tony Podesta was probably one of the most influential non-elected Democrats in Washington for 10 or 15 years. His brother John was a top aide to many Democratic presidents, including Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. He was the campaign chair for Hillary Clinton and would have been a senior member of her White House had she won in 2016. And Tony Podesta sort of fed off of that, created a massive lobbying firm in D.C. where his job was to influence Democratic administrations, get favors for his clients from Democrats in Congress. And at one point, I think he had the third largest lobbying firm in D.C. in about 2016.
What about his ex-wife?
He married Heather Podesta, who, after they got married, she became a lobbyist. She now runs one of the most successful female-owned, in fact, the most successful woman-owned lobbying firm in D.C. So for a while, they were married. They were a prominent Democratic power couple. They were huge fundraisers. Those two together were responsible for more campaign cash for the Democratic Party than any other couple in Washington. They were really sort of like the go-to couple in D.C. They had a huge art collection. They made tons of money. They traveled the world. And they were one of the most powerful and colorful Democratic teams in D.C. until they broke up. They split up in 2012, I believe, or started breaking up in 2012. An interesting thing happened in their divorce, which was that Tony Podesta had this huge multi-million-dollar art collection. He loved art. He loved modern art, and he had all these pieces that were incredibly valuable. When they were dividing their assets, he refused to give up any of the art, which means almost everything else went to his wife, his ex-wife. Once his ex-wife had all their liquid assets, he all of a sudden had this art, but not much else. So he had to make a lot more money. And in order to make a lot more money, he sort of shifted from corporate lobbying, where he was incredibly successful, to doing more work overseas, representing foreign clients, foreign governments, foreign companies, who generally pay a lot more. But we've seen with Paul Manafort and other people, lobbyists who do work for foreign clients, foreign countries, can often get in trouble. And that's what happened with Tony Podesta.
How did Tony Podesta and Paul Manafort work together?
Yeah, great question. So Paul Manafort became a big-time Republican lobbyist after Ronald Reagan won in 1980. What's interesting about Reagan that we sort of forget is that Reagan was the outsider back then. He was very similar to Donald Trump in that he was the anti-establishment person. In 1980, Jimmy Carter was the incumbent president. You know, the incumbent's supposed to win. George Bush was the establishment Republican. George Bush was supposed to win the primary. Instead, Ronald Reagan came in. So when Ronald Reagan won, and by the way, on his campaign, some of his young campaign workers were Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and a guy named Charlie Black. So when Reagan won, companies in D.C. all of a sudden wanted to know, they wanted access to Reagan. Who in Washington knows Reagan? There were not many Republican lobbyists in Washington at the time, in part because Democrats had controlled Congress for 30, 40 years at that point, so there weren't really many, Republicans didn't really matter in Congress, and therefore there weren't any big-time Republican lobbyists. Any Republican lobbyists that the city had were Nixon people who got flushed out of D.C. with Watergate. So Paul Manafort, after Reagan won, said, I can be a lobbyist. I know the people in the Reagan administration. I worked with them. So they started a firm called Black, Manafort and Stone. They represented all the big time companies of the 1980s, Salomon Brothers, TWA, Rupert Murdoch, and even Donald Trump. At some point, Paul Manafort wanted to make even more money. He was making millions of dollars then. He wanted to make even more money. And he realized that the way to make more money is to work overseas. So he went to Ukraine. He worked for the pro-Russian president of Ukraine for 6 or 7 years. During that time, he made $60 million, became incredibly wealthy, and then moved back to Washington and decided to work for the Trump campaign. When he was working on the Trump campaign, it was reported in the press that Paul Manafort had teamed up with Tony Podesta on a lobbying campaign on behalf of that Ukrainian pro-Russian president, and they hadn't properly filed their foreign agent registration forms. This is sort of complicated, but if you represent a foreign company or interest or political party, you need to file once every 6 months a foreign agent registration form, which basically says, hey, I work for this foreign government. Those two did not. Something that no one ever would have noticed except for the scrutiny that Paul Manafort got from the media when he was Donald Trump's campaign manager. So once he becomes campaign manager, the media starts looking into his career, realizes that he worked for the pro-Russian Ukrainian government, didn't file his form. That led to a big FBI investigation that became the Mueller probe, which ensnares both Paul Manafort and Tony Podesta and basically blew up both of their firms.
Why did Paul Manafort go to prison?
He went to prison for several reasons. He was charged with dozens and dozens and dozens of crimes related to all sorts of alleged wrongdoing. The main thing was that the $60 million that I said that he made in Ukraine, he tried to not pay tax on that and bring it back to the U.S. He fudged forms to make it seem like he had not made that money. So had he paid his taxes, he probably would have been fine. There were other crimes related to his work overseas. There's a type of form that you need to file with the U.S. Treasury Department if you have huge wire transfers overseas. He didn't file those forms. He also didn't fill out this Foreign Agent Registration Act form. So he eventually pled guilty to a whole range of crimes. There was plenty more that he could have been charged with that he wasn't.
How long was he in prison?
He was in prison for 3 or 4 years until he was let out when COVID started by the judicial system to have just home confinement. He had an ankle bracelet, so he was not actually in jail, but he was still incarcerated. And then right before Christmas in 2020, when Donald Trump had lost the election, was leaving, he pardoned Paul Manafort.
Tony Podesta, did he have any, was he charged with anything, and did he have any?
Tony Podesta was never charged, but in 2017, when Paul Manafort was charged, the indictment from Mueller's office that charged Paul Manafort essentially said that that his co-conspirators included Tony Podesta. So the media sort of very early on saw that Tony Podesta will probably get charged next. He was not charged, but that was enough to ruin his firm. All these big U.S. brand companies who were working with Tony Podesta and paying Tony Podesta millions of dollars to be their lobbyist, once they saw that he could be indicted for working with a pro-Russian foreign leader and not filing the forms, and he's caught up in the Mueller investigation, all of his clients sort of split and the firm imploded.
What's he doing today?
He actually, remarkably, still has a small lobbying firm. He's still a very wealthy man. He just recently sold his house for $10 million. He got remarried, and he represents, I would say, a small group of very highly paying foreign clients. So he's still doing pretty well.
How much money does Paul Manafort still have? And did he have to give any of it up when he was convicted?
He had to give almost all of it up when he was convicted, but after being pardoned, he gets a lot of it back, which is interesting. But back to Tony Podesta, what's interesting about him is that he's a very wealthy person. He just sold his house, like I told you. He's probably making more than $1 million a year as a lobbyist, but he'll never get back what he used to have. And what he used to have is that he was the most important person in Democratic politics in Washington. When big companies needed access to important members of Congress, important Democrats, or the president or administration officials, they called Tony Podesta. And when those same officials needed money to run their campaigns or to run ads, they went to Tony Podesta. So he was sort of like the center spoke of the Democratic Party for a long time, and now that's gone. I mean, now he sits around and his phone doesn't ring. Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have said, don't donate to me, don't come to our events. So he's really sort of a shunned figure these days.
As you know well, Black, Manafort, and Stone, Roger Stone, also pardoned by the president. But the figure you never hear about, you do mention it in your book, and I want you to tell us what happened, is Charlie Black. He was in that midst of all that. What's he think of Donald Trump and what happened to him?
Yeah, so Charlie Black always stayed on the straight and narrow, and therefore he's sort of not mentioned in a lot of these stories. So Charlie Black was the same age as Paul Manafort and Roger Stone when they started their firm, their lobbying firm in the 1980s after Reagan won. He worked on the campaign as well. They had a split about 10 years later. Charlie Black wanted to run a more professional organization, wanted to sell his lobbying firm to a bigger firm, a publicly traded firm that would have new rules and accounting regulations. Paul Manafort wanted none of that. He liked the way things were operating. So as soon as the firm was sold to Burson Marsteller, Charlie Black stayed and eventually became the CEO. And the other two split. They didn't want to deal with the regulations and the rules that came with being a publicly traded company. Black then stayed with several different iterations of the same firm, but he has always been, he sort of became a senior statesman of the Republican Party. He continued to work for big-time Republican candidates and senators. He was still a big player in Washington, but he never crossed the line. He never got himself in trouble. He sort of thought, he played by the rules, and Roger Stone and Paul Manafort obviously did not.
You've been doing this for years. How do you feel about this? Let's say you're talking to a group of young people, and you go through all this, and they look at you and say, "What should I expect about the future? What should I think about this process?"
So there's lots of things to be worried about, but also I think Washington D.C. is a great place to work, especially for young people. At first you don't make a lot of money, but you're doing important things. You're doing heady things. I tell reporters coming to D.C. that that's a lot of fun. You get a lot of power, you get a lot of access. One of the things I did when I was a young reporter was cover a couple small subcommittees on Capitol Hill, and it was a blast because you get to know the members of Congress, you get to know the lobbyists, you get to know the staffers, and you're really making legislation and laws. I think D.C. has gotten worse since then. It's gotten more partisan. I think companies have a lot more influence than they had back then. But I still think it's a fun place for young people to come and work. And I think I'm always optimistic, and I think things can change. I mean, one of the things that we sort of write about in our book also is that it could be that things are changing in Washington, and that companies are a little less influential than they were just a few years ago. We see more and more progressives on the left and populists on the right who are getting together to try to rein in companies. We've seen a bipartisan effort, back to Joshua Wright, a bipartisan effort to try to change antitrust law and make the government more strongly enforce antitrust laws. And that's bipartisan. I mean, in a normal world, companies would say, all right, Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor are really going after us on an antitrust front. Let's just elect a Republican and everything will go back to normal. But Donald Trump shares a lot of these views on so that the companies have gotten too big and too influential. So if there is another Trump administration, things could continue to get worse for corporations. So I think there is a growing populist change that could be helpful.
If Donald Trump were to be elected again as president, would Paul Manafort go to work for him?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that Paul Manafort, I think, is considered to be a big loser in Washington and in politics now. He's a convicted felon. He was pardoned by Trump. He lost all this money. He's sort of chewed up and spit out by D.C. But there's no one in Washington, there's no one on the planet who's gone to jail for Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as we know, values loyalty above anything else. And there's only one person who's proven his loyalty by going to jail for him, and that's Paul Manafort. So certainly, if Trump is elected, Paul Manafort will let it be known that he has access to Trump, and if you pay whatever exorbitant fee he's going to charge you, Like he'll essentially become a lobbyist and will probably be one of the more successful lobbyists we've ever seen.
What about, I mean, people went to jail like Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon. Are they going to get the loyalty treatment also?
I think that they could. But the difference with Paul Manafort is that Paul Manafort's done this before. He's sort of going back to Reagan. He's realized, how to use that access, use the personal relationships that he and other people don't have to a president to start a firm. So, by comparison, in the last time that Trump was elected, or the first time Trump was elected, one of the big-time lobbyists in D.C. was Brian Ballard. Brian Ballard had no office in D.C. He was a Florida fundraiser and lobbyist. He knew Donald Trump just tangentially, did some fundraising for him. They were not friends. When Trump won, Brian Ballard moved his operations to D.C., started a lobbying firm, and in 4 years made $100 million through the access that people knew he had to Trump. Paul Manafort could double that.
I'll ask it again. Anything wrong with this system?
So the problem with the system right now is that only one side has influence. I mean, before the 1970s, companies would come to Washington and lobby. Labor unions were strong and they were lobbying. Ralph Nader's and consumer groups were lobbying. Environmental groups had interest, and all these competing factions would battle each other. What's happened since the 1970s is that the companies have poured so much money into D.C. that they basically eliminated labor unions. Environmental groups don't have the influence they have. The Ralph Nader just aren't around anymore. So the problem right now is that companies are the only interest group in D.C. and they just have so much power that it's hard for the government to do anything that doesn't benefit them.
Where are you from?
From Washington, D.C.
Where'd you go to school?
Went to Gonzaga High School down here and then Northwestern University out in Chicago.
When did you decide you wanted to be a journalist?
I was one of those weird people in like 6th or 7th grade. I don't know why. I just decided I wanted to be a journalist or wanted to be a writer. I think in high school I started reading the great books about biographies about presidents. I started reading about the great campaigns of 1960 and 1968 and just sort of really got into politics. And then at some point I switched and decided I wanted to be a reporter in Washington, but I wanted to cover companies and industry and less presidential politics.
The name of the book is The Wolves of K Street, and our earlier conversation was from a Wall Street Journal article in June about Joshua Wright, and we thank you, Brody Mullins, very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.